The decade of the 1960s was the time when baby boomers, people born after World War II, became young adults. Many baby boomers began to question the previous generation, blaming them for a world that seemed unresponsive to demands for social justice and change on behalf of the underprivileged. The seeds of global humanitarianism that had been sown after World War II saw full flower in these young adults of the 1960s. Their alienation from Western culture, from its materialism, its industrialism, its bureaucracy, fed their discontent. In the late 1960s, a loosely connected movement for political and social change swept across university campuses in a number of Western countries. This youth revolt challenged long-established hierarchies, party politics, and consumerism. In some countries, like the United States, the revolt was more explicitly tied to the civil rights movement or the Vietnam War, while in Europe, these movements tended to be tied to economic or social concerns, even colonial concerns. Globally, the revolts of the 1960s also ushered in a new type of politics, identity politics, through which individuals identifying themselves with specific social identities, gay or black, female or disabled, they lobbied for the extension of equal rights. In the spring of 1968, demonstrations began in Paris against the rigidity of the French university system, which remained largely in the hands of the elite. Intellectual discontent was heightened by general popular opposition to the war in Vietnam. Students spoke out against those, most often rich white men, who held political power, and they spoke out against inequality and even against modern technology, which they referred to as dehumanizing. In the Latin Quarter, where students attended the Sorbonne, graffiti proclaimed, "Comrades, the revolution is daily. It is a festival, an explosion." At the beginning of May, a student radical, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, nicknamed Danny the Red and widely considered a leader of these protests, was expelled from the University of Paris. In protest, students and young faculty members occupied the university buildings at the Sorbonne, which housed the university's humanities and languages faculties. Police entered the Sorbonne and began arresting students, but the demonstrators simply fanned out and were joined by most of the remaining student body. Several students were killed and hundreds hurt in the ensuing demonstrations when police attacked the students' improvised barricades. Unlike in the United States, where most of the working class felt that student demonstrations were too radical and where there was more general support for the Vietnam War among adults, French adults, industrial workers, also took to the streets. A general strike began on May 13th in protest against police brutality. This was the largest wave of French strikes since the Depression. Workers demanded pay raises, rights to self-management, and better working conditions. Unions and the Communist Party, which had influence among the workers, had little to do with this movement. If anything, these organizations tried to control them. In other words, these had been spontaneous demonstrations.
Paris. At first it looked as if things were returning to normal. The capital and many other centres in France were on the move. But so too were students and other left-wing demonstrators who weren't content to let the fight for their cause, whatever it is, just peter out. Quickly the situation reverted to ugly street warfare, with riot police giving no quarter and getting none in return. While the violent clashes were taking place in Paris, strikers reoccupied the Peugeot factory at Sochaux, eastern France, after hours of bloody fighting, during which a man was shot dead and many injured. The Paris mob were incensed by that death. They were on the warpath. The students were using Molotov cocktails, petrol-filled bottles, which they showered on the police. Police retaliated with tear gas grenades. President de Gaulle and his ministers acted quickly. They banned all open-air demonstrations until after the elections on July 1st. They also outlawed 7 anarchist and dissident communist organizations. One of them is the movement of March 22nd, founded by Daniel Cohn-Bendit, Red Danny, who was in Britain. But even as these top-level moves were being made, war raged in the streets of Paris. they began the job of cleaning up the battlefields that are the streets of a city.
Karen Mahler, a young British woman who traveled to France in May of 1968, she's pictured here, specifically to participate in these demonstrations led by some of her French friends, recalled her time there in a poignant way. She said, quote, "I loved the French being so un-French. Instead of asking, 'What is this going to cost us?' which was their usual response in times of crisis, they asked, 'Who will we be when this is over? How will it change the minds and spirits of our children?'" Interestingly, after the 1968 Student Revolution, the University of Paris was dissolved and replaced with the Paris Sorbonne University in 1970. Its main campus remains the Sorbonne, which houses the university's massive library, but its classrooms are reserved for third-year university students and graduate students, although students of Semitic studies take classes at the Sorbonne throughout their academic careers. While France's student demonstrations were the longest and most violent student-led protests in Europe in 1968, they weren't the only protests. West German, Italian, and Spanish students also rose up in protest. In West Germany, protests often centered around university officials who'd had ties to the Nazi regime and had never been prosecuted. Italian students protested the ridiculous student-teacher ratio, 200 to 1, and they wanted educational reform. In Spain, students and workers protested for better working conditions and educational reforms, and against Franco's fascist regime. Conservative Prime Minister Georges Pompidou was forced to return from a state visit to Afghanistan to help President Charles de Gaulle confront this student crisis. In mid-May, de Gaulle left France, briefly, to assure himself of the loyalty of the French army units stationed in Germany. Returning to France, de Gaulle dissolved the National Assembly, that was the lower, directly elected house of the French Parliament, and then he announced that new elections for the Parliament would be held at the end of June. In the meantime, de Gaulle supporters organized counter-demonstrations in support of the conservative government, playing on the traditional hostility of suburban and rural middle-class and peasant citizens to urban demonstrators. The strike movement ebbed, partly because the government and private companies agreed to wage increases. The students were once more standing alone in rebellion, and in the June elections, the conservative Gaullist party won even more parliamentary seats. The government outlawed several left-leaning organizations, and student leaders called off their street demonstrations. While there were resurgent demonstrations on Bastille Day of 1968, in the end, the students were forced back without the reforms that they'd wanted. De Gaulle, however, had misjudged the strength of the Gaullist victory. He'd thought it a personal mandate, that his party had, after all, taken 75% of the seats in the National Assembly, so whatever he wanted to do, he could. He and his Prime Minister, Georges Pompidou, however, disagreed over the limits of presidential power, and Pompidou resigned as Prime Minister. His successor couldn't rein de Gaulle in either. De Gaulle decided to move forward with a plan to further decentralize France's government and thus limit the powers of the French Parliament. In 1969, the president announced a referendum on local administrative reform, hoping to create a series of regional councils which would have broadly extended powers, particularly taking control of public utilities, of housing, and in organization and urbanization. He also wanted to minimize the powers of the Senate, that was the indirectly elected upper house of the French Parliament. He wanted to make it a consulting body with no veto power whatsoever. De Gaulle had great hopes for his referendum, but it failed. Nearly 55% of the French population voted no. As it turns out, despite his great World War II hero reputation, most French people increasingly saw de Gaulle as out of touch, too full of ego in his old age, he was 78, to be trusted to govern. In the words of some, they wanted a conservative party without de Gaulle. They called it Gaullism without de Gaulle. Having lost the referendum, de Gaulle announced his retirement from political life, withdrawing to a village in eastern France. He died suddenly in 1970 from a burst blood vessel. Communist Europe also saw significant calls for reform. In Czechoslovakia, intellectuals and writers accused the Communist Party leadership of clinging to Stalinism, and the party leadership itself realized it was time to change. In January of 1968, party leaders named Alexander Dubček, a liberal, that is, a non-communist, Slovak to be the first secretary of the Communist Party, and thus the head of the Czech state. Well, during the Prague Spring, Dubček tried to implement what he called socialism with a human face by implementing reforms. These were very popular, so Dubček extended them. At the same time, he and other party leaders wondered whether the Soviet Union would intervene in their experiment. While the Soviets were indeed worried, they feared that Czechoslovakia was moving closer to a Western model. On August 21st, Soviet tanks and troops moved across the border and into Prague. They put an end to Prague Spring. Under the Brezhnev Doctrine, the Soviet leadership tried to justify the invasion of Czechoslovakia and the possibility of future intervention in any of the satellite states in Eastern Europe. For the next 20 years, Eastern European countries faced stifling domination by their communist parties, backed, as these were, by the Soviet Union. Poland, too, was embroiled in anti-Soviet tensions. A student demonstration led to riots in the streets. On March 13th, all Polish universities began a strike. Between the 13th and the 24th, there were more strikes, protests, marches. University buildings were occupied by student protesters. So on March 25th, Warsaw University fired 6 faculty members whose sympathies remained with the protesters. On the 28th, 3,000 students marched in protest of these firings. 34 of them were expelled, 11 suspended, 200 were injured, and 11 academic departments were closed. As some of the student protesters were Jewish, the anti-Zionist movement of the government retaliated against them. Some 13,000 Jewish university students were expelled between 1968 and 1971. The government also claimed that this demonstration was in retaliation for the Jew support of the Zionists of Israel, who'd embarked on the Arab-Israeli War in 1967. As part of this repression, Polish Jews lost their Polish citizenship and were instead referred to as being of Jewish nationality. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia brought about another chill in Cold War relations. That invasion had even brought criticism from communist parties in Italy and in Spain, where communists began to refer to themselves as Euro-communists, so as to stress their independence from the Soviet Union. Accepting that Western nations had different paths of historical development, Euro-communists collaborated freely with socialists and with other liberals. The development of Euro-communism, however, did not stop the declining influence of the Communist Party in all Western European countries, with the exception of Italy. As it turns out, the social and cultural turmoil of the 1960s would give way to economic and political turmoil in the 1970s. By 1960, the 6 common market countries, led by Germany, had surpassed the United States in percentage of gross world product. While the common market maintained this lead throughout the decade, its economic ascent slowed down in the 1960s. However, as it turns out, economic preeminence in the later part of the 20th century would depend on having access to energy, and the most valuable energy source was, and remains, oil. Europe is certainly not a major producer of oil, and so was dependent on other oil-producing nations for their energy source. During the 1970s, the Middle East's oil-producing nations dealt Western dominance a serious blow. OPEC's regulation of oil supplies as a reaction against Western support of Israel during the Six-Day War of 1967 and the Yom Kippur War, or the Ramadan War, of 1973, provoked an economic recession in the West. Unemployment rose more than 50% in Western Europe by the end of the decade. In France, for example, from a 2.9 unemployment rate to 6.5% by the end of the decade. Traditional economic theories were not enough to counter this new problem. Skyrocketing interest rates in the West. Over the 1970s in France, inflation rates rose from 4.95% to 13.73%. Well, these discouraged industrial investment and consumer buying. With prices, unemployment, and interest rates all soaring, a situation known as stagflation, the West had finally come to realize that their economic prosperity had its limits. By the early 1970s, the U.S., meanwhile, was still the leading single producer in most economic fields, but had become a major debtor. The U.S.'s domestic focus on the military, due both to the Cold War and specifically to the Vietnam War, and on imported goods had caused inflation and trade deficit. Dollars had flooded the international market, decreasing the dollar's value. As a result, the Bretton Woods currency system collapsed in 1971, a crisis which strengthened European integration as common market countries cooperated to prevent financial chaos. In 1973, and largely as a result of economic stress, Britain joined the common market, and later Ireland and Denmark did the same. The common market's exports were now 3 times those of the United States. That said, not everyone was happy to join the common market, as you can pretty clearly see with the poster. Despite the economic situation, there were some attempts to break the stalemate of the Cold War through diplomacy, especially economic diplomacy. In Germany, Social Democrats had come to power in 1969, helped by an alliance with the centrist party, the Free Democrats. Willy Brandt, the former mayor of Berlin, became the Chancellor of Germany. While remaining committed to NATO, Brandt improved relations with the German Democratic Republic, calling for an opening toward the East. This political philosophy was known as Neue Ostpolitik. Brandt recognized the Polish resistant fighters of World War II during a state visit to Poland in 1970, the first time a German politician had recognized that Poland resisted Nazi Germany. He signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, hoping for the development of trade between his country and theirs. He signed the Treaty of Warsaw, which improved German relations with Poland by recognizing the pre-war border between Germany and Poland. It seemed as though a thaw was returning to Cold War Europe. In 1971, Brandt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. He also embarked on significant domestic reforms. For example, he extended entitlements, like the education budget, like family housing subsidies, like unemployment benefits and accident benefits. He reformed various workplace policies. Military vocational programs were open to everyone. Maternity benefits were introduced. And he extended general liberal policies like lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. But while Brandt's domestic policies were hugely popular, not all West Germans supported his Neue Politik. Some politicians left Brandt's party and even his governing coalition, so that his party was now in the minority in the Bundestag. In 1972, he faced a crisis in the Bundestag when a political competitor instituted a vote of no confidence, but the vote failed. Brandt, it seems, survived, and he'd be able to continue his reforms. However, in 1974, Brandt was forced to resign from office amid news that his secretary, Gunther Guillaume, was a spy for East Germany's Ministry for State Security, or Stasi. Brandt was in on the sting organized by the German government. He continued to work closely with Guillaume and even went on vacation with him to continue seeking information. When Guillaume was arrested, Brandt resigned his position as chancellor. His replacement was Helmut Schmidt, a more conservative social democrat. Schmidt wasn't the diplomat that Brandt had been. He angered his constituency when he asked the United States to station medium-range nuclear missiles on West German soil, for example. In addition, economic recession, unemployment, and his refusal to reduce welfare payments, which alienated the Social Democrats' ally, the Social Free Democrats, led to the return of the more conservative party, the Christian Democrats, during the next election. Turmoil engulfed southern Europe as well. Cypriot independence from Britain had been achieved in 1959. However, that in no way meant that the tensions present between Turks and Greeks, or between pro- and anti-communist groups, just went away. An independent Cyprus had never been acceptable to Greek nationalists in Athens, who wanted to see Cyprus become a part of Greece. In 1963, a crisis broke out over the proportion of Greeks and Turks in the Cypriot parliament, police, and bureaucracy, and this led to inter-ethnic violence on the island. That year, violence between Greek and Turkish Cypriots broke out over what became known as Bloody Christmas. A United Nations peacekeeping force was introduced to forestall a Turkish invasion. Both Greece and Turkey resorted to military threats, but neither side was willing to engage in an actual war. In the late 1960s, tensions over Cyprus dovetailed with Greek domestic political problems. Greece's post-Civil War politics had become a complicated three-way affair. Still a constitutional monarchy, the Hellenic Parliament was caught between 3 parties: the Republican Center Union Party, balanced between the Communist United Democratic Left, and the right-wing, pro-dictatorship National Radical Union. When the Center Union government failed to pursue a gnosis union with Cyprus, a group of middle-level army officers, known collectively as the colonels, seized power in a coup in April of 1967. In June, in response to an aborted coup led by monarchists, the leader of the colonels, Georgios Papadopoulos, declared Greece a republic. While Papadopoulos would be replaced in November, King Constantine II and his family were nonetheless forced to flee into exile. In early 1974, a referendum formally abolished the Greek monarchy. The Greek royal family lived for a time in Denmark because the queen was a princess of Denmark, then moved to London. King Constantine II is godfather to Prince William. Since 2013, the family has resided once again in Greece. While holding no political power in Greece, members of the family are still referred to as prince or princess since they are also Danish royalty. The Crown Prince, Pavlos, and his family currently live in Britain. His wife is British, but they lived for years in the United States, and 4 of their 5 children were born in the U.S. and are thus American citizens. Greece's new military regime, led by the colonels, continued working towards union with Cyprus. In 1974, however, a Turkish invasion of Cyprus, this is known as the Cyprus Affair, completely discredited the military regime as they were clearly not addressing enosis. The Greek army repudiated the junta and civilian rule was restored to Greece. The Greek political landscape after 1974 continued to move along paths unconnected to bipolar Cold War patterns, and Greek voters also refused to return to political models based on the 1940s. A plebiscite rejected a restoration of the monarchy. So, in place of the old 3-sided political party landscape, elections after 1974 revolved around the rise to power of PASOK, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement, led by Andreas Papandreou. Based on elements that had resisted the junta, PASOK combined socialist rhetoric and populist economic promises with an anti-Turkish nationalism. Because the United States failed to support Greece during the Cyprus Affair, PASOK was anti-American as well. In fact, from 1974 to 1980, Greece did not participate in NATO's command structure. In the 1981 elections, PASOK became the largest Greek party, and Andreas Papandreou became prime minister, a post he first held until 1989, and then again from 93 to 96, despite significant government corruption, including his indictment by the Hellenic Parliament for embezzlement. While PASOK did not follow through on threats to leave NATO, Papandreou did break with the Western Bloc by supporting a Polish military government and seeking international neutrality. The new Greek Republic remained mired in the economic problems it had faced before. Insufficient economy, based largely on tourism. The Turkish invasion of Cyprus was not as quickly resolved. Following a de facto partition, the Turkish zone along the northern coast constituted itself as a separate state. The Turkish Federated State of Cyprus, with 37% of the island's area and just 18% of the island's population, was created. This remains a source of friction between Greece and Turkey, except it's now called the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, and it's only recognized by Turkey. In southern Europe, dictatorships also fell in Portugal and Spain. In Portugal, anti-fascist dictator António Salazar, who'd been in power since 1932, died in 1970. His immediate successors, primarily authoritarians, did little to better the country's economic situation, and as a result, many Portuguese left the country for either France or the Americas. In 1974, the Carnation Revolution, initially led by a group of liberal army officers, overthrew the dictatorship, and the Socialist Party emerged victorious after elections in 1975. The immediate consequences of this change in government resulted in Portugal's withdrawal from its remaining colonies in Africa, although they'd keep Macau until 1999 and East Timor until 2002. The Socialist Party has been ruling Portugal either alone or in majority, or at the head of a coalition since 1975. In Spain, Franco had continued as dictator. His formal title was caudillo, and worked to maintain his power over time. Officially, Spain remained a monarchy, although Franco never took that title. While Franco largely accepted economic modernization, he did not support the growing secularization of the late 20th century. In the late 1960s, opposition to Franco's traditionalist regime mounted in Catalonia and in the Basque Country, Spain's most industrial regions, each with a strong separatist movement. Franco hit hard at these movements. He withdrew the recognition of these areas' native languages and regional autonomy that inhibited them from overthrowing his government. In the late 1960s, Franco agreed that Juan Carlos de Borbón, son of the Crown Prince of Spain, would succeed him as head of state. Franco had taken special notice of Juan Carlos and had tried to guide and groom him as Franco's heir. Yes, Franco was married and he had a child, but that child was a daughter, and with his traditionalist views, he did not see her as an heir. Well, Franco assumed that upon his death, Spain would remain an authoritarian country and Juan Carlos would be recognized as King of Spain. Already within his government, however, people believed that liberal political reform was inevitable. Well, Franco died in 1975 after a long illness. Juan Carlos became king 2 days later, and to the surprise of many, introduced reforms which would transform Spain into a constitutional monarchy with a democratic parliamentary structure, a change which was formalized by the Constitution of 1978. As a result of these changes, Spain emerged from international isolation and survived several right-wing attempts to overthrow this very new government in the 1970s. Sweden stood out as a sore thumb from the rest of Europe, which, because of the economic strain of stagflation, had begun moving away from the old model of traditional welfare state in the 1970s. As in France, welfare state policies had encouraged business people to invest outside of Sweden, causing economic stagnation. When productivity lagged, the Swedish government denied benefits to unemployed workers who refused retraining or a job offer. They also reduced their dependence on foreign oil by cutting consumption in half between 1976 and 1986 in an attempt to jumpstart their economy. Despite a highly productive workforce, Sweden dropped in per capita income, and business people continued to look elsewhere, to countries where taxation was far lower. Sweden's economic problems worsened with increased immigration in the late 1970s. Initially inviting immigrants so as to increase their tax base, this program was still costly. The government offered each immigrant a choice of subsidized housing in neighborhoods inhabited primarily by Swedes or by people from the immigrants' native land. Sweden's tax rate on its top earners was 85% by 1980, and many of those top earners, what we today call the 1%, had chosen to leave Sweden rather than stay and be subject to such taxation. Sweden faced a problem. Trying to create a welfare state which included so many entitlements was plainly not working. So what to do? The 1970s brought another depressing element into everyday life: terrorism. Terrorism has long been a part of human societies, but in the 1970s and onward, terror became a way of responding to political climates and worsening economic conditions. In West Germany, the Baader-Meinhof group, better known as the Red Army faction or the RAF, were a far-left militant group advocating Marxism. They were supported by the East German Stasi. In their quest to bring Marxism to Germany, the gang engaged in a series of activities, bombings, assassinations, robberies, which led them to be labeled a terrorist group by the German government. In 1977, their activity peaked. Although the events are called German Autumn, the activity actually began in the spring. In April, the RAF attempted to kidnap the Attorney General of West Germany. He was shot, but not killed. In July, the group shot and killed Jürgen Ponto, the head of a major German bank, in a foiled kidnapping attempt. In September, members of the gang ambushed a convoy carrying industrialist Hans Schleyer. In the ambush, 4 members of the convoy were killed, and Schleyer was kidnapped. The kidnappers wanted in exchange the release of 4 first-generation RAF members who'd been imprisoned since 1970. When the government refused to comply, Schleyer was killed. The 4 RAF members were mysteriously found dead in their prison cells. Additionally, a Lufthansa airplane, the Landshut, was hijacked by the PFLP, a group which advocated for the liberation of Palestine and who had allied with the RAF. They killed the captain and then took the passengers hostage in Somalia, demanding the release of 10 RAF and 2 Palestinian prisoners and $15 million. As they didn't quite get. In other places in Europe, terrorism was linked to separatist movements. In Spain, advocates for the independence of the Basque nation targeted anti-separatist Spanish politicians and police. The Euskadi da Askatasuna, which translates to Basque Country and Freedom, or ETA, was most active in the last 2 years of the 1970s, with 242 people killed. An agreement for ceasefire with the Spanish government in the early 80s led to a cessation of fighting, but the rise of Gaulle, the paramilitary anti-terrorist group, targeted former and suspected ETA members and renewed the violence in what was known as the Dirty War. One of the first casualties of this dirty war, thanks to an ETA car bomb, was Eugene Kent Brown, an American citizen. In Britain, nationalist and religious violence continued to pit Catholics against Protestants in Northern Ireland. Catholics experienced job discrimination and a lack of civil rights, and so a 1969 student protest was organized in order to show support for union with the Republic of Ireland. But as the violence escalated, British troops were sent in, and on January 30th of 1972, Bloody Sunday, these troops fired at demonstrators, killing 13 of them, and setting off a cycle of violence that left 500 people dead by the end of that year. Well, Protestants were fearful of losing their political dominance to the reinvigorated Irish Republican Army, which carried out bombings and assassinations in order to achieve the union of the two Irelands and to end the oppression of Catholics. The toils and troubles of the late 60s and 1970s resulted in a desire for calm, for peace, for different. As a result, the elections of the early 1980s often brought different political parties to power, often with a significant mandate for reform. The question was, were the proposed reforms truly what the people wanted?